I think Elden Ring and its DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree, are easily the best examples of how to handle open world level design, and I think the majority of other open world games don't even come close. Bold statement, sure, but hear me out for a second, okay? What's the first design principle that comes to mind when you think of an open world game? Likely something along the lines of exploration, or more importantly, giving the player freedom. But let's be real for a second, guys, alright? Freedom in games is an illusion, alright? Games function within the confines of what the devs have programmed. Like, you can't do something that hasn't been put into the game. Even if you go off the beaten path and don't do what the game tells you, well, that's still something the devs have considered, and eventually, if you want to progress, you'll have to come back around to following what the game tells you. But that's fine. I'm not saying this as a big negative. I actually tend to prefer carefully crafted scenarios and designs over a facade of being so big and open and free. But regardless, players are attracted to open world games for that idea of freedom and the feeling of exploration. So there's obviously a balance here. How do you give players that sense of openness that they crave while also guiding them along so that the game can actually have some balancing, structure, or any sense of progression? Well, if you're a generic open world game, you can add in 500 UI elements that handhold your every move, or if you're Elden Ring, you can do it visually. There is a term in the world of film called mise en scène, and it refers to the staging of the environment, props, lights, and actors in a scene with the goal of conveying some idea through that scene, be it a mood, a theme, a story beat. The point being that it's not simply about what is framed within the shot, but why it's framed within the shot, and what that conveys to the audience. In video game design, this general principle of conveying info to the audience is often referred to as signposting. And while sometimes, yes, it can be a literal sign, it's more about how you guide players towards objectives, how you grab their attention, and how you convey information to them visually. Ideally, the majority of this is done through a combination of lighting, level design, and environment design. Some basic examples would be a door being slightly ajar, letting us know it can be opened. Or a red barrel sitting on a platform, prompting us to shoot at it and trigger a reaction. Or even just a light shining on a specific place, highlighting that this is the path forward. Linear games have a slightly easier time handling it because, well, there's usually only one route forwards, and if there's a place players can't go, they can often get away with just blocking off the wrong path. But since open world games are far more expansive, it's often difficult to convey that info and keep players on the main path. So a lot of games default back to essentially just hand-holding the player's every move with endless amounts of text, checklists galore, map markers, guiding red lines, etc., etc. Sometimes some of these are necessary evils, like the classic bird shit on ledges, but oftentimes it can feel really lame and artificial, and in my opinion, can simply just make the games feel less free and open, since you're essentially just following exactly what the UI elements are telling you at all times. But simply removing those UI elements isn't really a fix, because often these games are designed exclusively around the use of these. So taking them out would remove most of the guidance for the player as well. I mean, go into any of these other open world games and turn off the HUD. You're gonna have no idea where to go. If a mission in Halo Infinite tells you to visit Sergeant Dude at an outpost, well, good luck finding him, because the map all looks identical and it's constantly broken up by massive amounts of wasted space or terrain that blocks your view. I mean, shit, half the mission markers in this game appear in the side of a mountain, but the mission is actually somewhere else on the other side that you just can't see because the dumbass mountain is blocking your view, yet that mountain doesn't actually serve a purpose other than to make the player spend time traversing around it to pad out the length of the game. It most certainly isn't guiding you anywhere, and without that map marker, you wouldn't even know which direction to look for the objective. This is not good level design, and even worse visual design. Same can be said for a lot of standard open world games. I mean, take Far Cry, Days Gone, Just Cause, Assassin's Creed, etc., etc. Apply this same logic to them, and take notice how vital the HUD is to any of your progress. If you turn off the markers, the games often do nothing else to guide you. And sure, I mean, you can just stumble around blind and go do a bunch of random shit, but you're never actually going to progress much without some form of external guidance. Now, of course, there are always exceptions, and one of them is Ghost of Tsushima, which kind of skirts around this by having the guiding wind mechanic, which, I mean, technically it is just a glorified red line, but, it does deserve credit for finding a natural way to weave that into its world and design. But aside from a few small examples like that, I just think this logic is true for the vast majority of open world games. And look, I'm not saying that having this UI instantly makes a game bad or anything, please don't confuse it with that. But what I am saying is that leaning on it as a crutch can often lead to a less compelling game world, in my opinion. But okay, yes, what makes Elden Ring special in that regard? How does it guide you without the use of those UI elements? Well, we can start right from the opening of the game. Now, this moment is undoubtedly a great visual, but I also think it's kind of the best example of mise-en-scène or signposting in an open world game. So take a look for a second. What do you see? Where do you want to go first? After you're done gawking at the vista and talking with Rivera, your eyes were probably drawn to one of three paths presented to you. Some people might look left and see the cliffs and think, ooh, maybe there's something down that way. Some might be drawn towards that first main landmark with a big enemy right in front of it. And others might look to the right and see the path leading over to a larger area and think to go over there first. Right off the bat, you've been offered three distinct routes for your exploration, and it's been done almost subconsciously, without needing a checklist or map markers telling you what to interact with first. And even more importantly, all three routes will lead to drastically different experiences for the player. Some might find the seaside cave that leads to a duo boss fight and mini island. Some might get pile-drived by the tree sentinel. And others might run into a dragon right at the start or get teleported across the map. Just about everyone who's played Elden Ring will remember their first few moments of the game or which boss or area they went to first, and the game is designed in a way that enhances that experience through giving you more meaningful exploration that you, the player, can decide upon. And all three of these potential routes also offer important information to the player regarding quests or just general early game experiences. Your first encounter with a merchant will likely be at the church or down by the shoreline. Your first encounter with a trap will be over to the right, and your first encounter with an enemy that's way higher level will be right in front of you. All of those experiences are important for the player to learn because they're going to happen many times later in the game. But instead of just marking all this out and forcing players to cross it off their checklist, letting them naturally find it on their own makes it feel like a much more personalized journey, like you're actually heading out into the world and figuring out where you want to go. I mean, compare that to something out of an Ubisoft game where nobody is going to tell you about the first objective marker they ran up to and how cool that was, or the first infinitely respawning enemy that they killed. This opening visual also takes your first big objective, reaching Stormvale Castle, and puts it center stage, layering it above everything else. Right from these first few moments of the game, it implants in the player's mind that this is a major point of interest that they need to reach. But once again, it doesn't give you some giant quest marker or mission log to explicitly tell you about it or hold your hand forwards. It trusts in its own level design, and more importantly, it trusts in the player's intelligence to perceive the castle and make their way there on their own accord. And then lastly, we have this big old tree in the background. I think the giant Erd tree is one of the simplest but best pieces of environment design in this game, because having a giant landmark you can always see serves as a constant beacon of your end goal. And if you're ever lost or unsure of where to go, you can always orient yourself using the tree, and heading towards it is never going to be a bad idea and will usually lead to progressing further in the game. Now, with all that said, let's imagine for a second if this were any other open world game or made by any other company. That opening would have told you all the same information, except it would have conveyed it using a ton of UI elements and text all over your screen. I mean, there's this famous meme that got made that was like, Elden Ring if it was made by Ubisoft. And I mean, obviously they went a bit overboard, but truthfully, it's not that far off. I mean, shit, let's just make one for ourselves real quick, all right? After entering the open world, like, you're undoubtedly going to have a UI marker on Vare that tells you to speak to him before moving on, and then after you do that, he'd tell you about all the next steps, right? There'd be a marker on the church, there'd be a big overall objective listed like, go to Stormvale Castle. There probably would have been a checklist of nearby things to do. You'd 100% have a mini-map in the corner that would display these icons along with any other potential areas of interest that show up as question marks. And, oh yeah, your character would probably say something cringe. So, comparing the two, which one feels more free? And which one feels like it respects your intelligence more? The answer to both is the FromSoft version. Though, let's be real for a second, if this were made by a different company, the level design would not be this good to begin with, and you wouldn't even be able to see all your objectives because they'd probably put a big old mountain right in your way and make you follow mission markers up the side of it because players can't be trusted to walk 10 feet without guidance according to games like Days Gone. But anyway, back to Elden Ring. These core ideas of design are not limited to just the opening of the game. I mean, we can look pretty far into the DLC as well. There's a particularly good moment in the gorgeous Cerulean Coast where the game positions one cliff higher above the rest and puts it right in view from the first sight of Grace in that area, ensuring that every time you die, you're going to respawn and see that cliff out in the distance, which puts the idea in your head that it must be important. And of course, it is. Once again, this information is conveyed entirely visually, and the game trusts your intelligence to perceive it and venture over to it on your own accord. I also love how both the main game and the DLC make sure that most of the main points of interest can be seen from high above. Even when there are clouds, most of the major landmarks peek their heads through in some way, which gives you a natural checklist of places to go without having any intrusive UI. And there's tons more examples I can touch on, like the opening of the DLC doing exactly what made the base game's opening special, conveying all this different information. So many important areas being literally heightened above everything else to enhance their importance. Giant arches or paths inviting you to venture through and find what's on the other side. Some items or landmarks hinting at what you're about to stumble across to hopefully pique your interest to head further in that direction. I mean, the list goes on, but I'll stop here because I don't want to ramble forever, and I think I've made my point. I just really think Elden Ring's level design and FromSoft's trust in the player is such a breath of fresh air in the current landscape of open-world games that feel paint by numbers and very hand-holdy. I get that a lot of gamers are drawn to that illusion of freedom and openness, and I mean shit, clearly I certainly like when games have good, meaningful exploration, but I just think that a lot of these other open-world games kinda don't. For me, seeing all that stuff all over the screen, telling me every specific thing that you need to do, to the point where you would actively have no real idea of what to do without it, makes it feel pretty artificial and makes that sense of freedom disappear quickly. Of course, Elden Ring is far from the first game to ever use good signposting or mise-en-scène, and it's not the first open world to try and be less intrusive either. But I think that FromSoft's really the first one to nail it on this level. The design of Elden Ring just lends itself to a much better sense of freedom and exploration because it feels like you're actively making those choices about your exploration, progressing deeper into the world, figuring things out for yourself, and carving out your own experience, which makes a playthrough feel more unique and personal. Of course, this entire time, you've actually been subtly guided by FromSoft, but you don't really notice it, so that illusion of freedom is not shattered, making for a much more compelling experience. And that is the crux of what engaging game design is all about. Alright guys, if you made it this far, thanks for watching, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. I got a couple videos lined up for the next few months that I'm hoping to get together, and there's a pretty solid slate of games releasing later this year, so I'll definitely be getting out some more normal reviews as well. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.